contradicting the Bible because he was teaching that the earth orbits the sun. So it's just a little bit of evidence to come to conclusions that perhaps he wasn't a devout Roman Catholic, but I do believe that he believed in God. And in his last 3 years of life, up until then, he didn't. He was so busy studying botany and geology and the human body and everything else. He didn't have the time to study religion like he wanted to. But in his last 3 years, he really tried to get into understanding the Roman Catholic Church. And he did confess, and he did ask for forgiveness, and he definitely was a member of the church and wanted to be in heaven at the end. This is the most famous painting in the world. And I have to tell you that when I did art history in Greensboro schools, the day I did Mona Lisa, I said, "This is the most famous painting in the world." And this one little child says, "How'd you get it?" One of the things you'll notice about, and they don't really know for sure who this person is, they think it was Lisa del Giocondo, the wife of a Florentine merchant, but this painting is little. It's 31 inches high and 21 inches wide. It's small. But despite the fact that they don't know who it really is, a couple of things I want to point out. You know, back at that time, eyebrows and eyelashes were not in vogue. And they think that originally there may have been eyebrows, but they were painted out. It's hard to tell, but there are no eyebrows or eyelashes. And again, I'm going down to this sfumato, this shadowy blending, particularly around the mouth. And people are constantly debating, well, is she smiling or is she mad? Or is it a heave? And, it's an unadorned dress. The eyes and the hands have no competition with the rest of the picture. The dramatic landscape in the back, he put a lot of landscape in his paintings. So those are some of the reasons why it's been so revered. And he painted it in oil, and I've heard many stories that he carried it around with him forever. He painted it at the age of 51, and he died at the age of 67, and so he did have it in his possession, because in the last 3 years of his life, he ended up in France. Francis I, thank you. Fred and I were talking about this last night. Francis I brought him over he gave him his own little estate, and that's why the painting ended up in the Louvre, I believe. This is the Virgin and Child with St. Anne, and one of the things that I think is interesting about this one, Mary is on her mother's knee. Mary's leaning forward to restrain the Christ child. The Christ child is playing roughly with a lamb, which is a sign of his own impending sacrifice. So it's just a significant painting to me. Painted in 1510, now he died in 1519, so it was 9 years before he died. And it's also in the Louvre, so he maybe brought it with him as well. Leonardo left Italy for good in 1516, 3 years before he died. The French ruler, Francis I, as we mentioned, offered him the title Premier Painter and Engineer and Architect to the King. Gave him a pension, gave him a country house, the Chateau of Cloix, which is now Cloix-Lucé. Forgive my lack of French. Fred and Jerry said that they visited Amboise, France, which is about in the middle of France, and saw a tomb with his name on it, but actually his remains are not in there because when he died, he was buried at the Palace Church of St. Florentine in France, and the French Revolution nearly destroyed the church, and it was totally demolished in the 1800s. So they can't identify his remains, but they do have a tomb dedicated to him. He had two friends that were with him most of his life. One was a gentleman by the name of Salai, and he was a very good-looking young man. He lived with Da Vinci for a long time, but he was a thief, and Da Vinci kept catching him stealing things from him. Why he left him to live with him, one can only imagine. He was a student, and he had another student by the name of Count Francesco Melzi. He was the son of a Lombard aristocrat. And he was a teacher to both and loyal to both. And when he died in France, Melzi had gone over with him. He left his estate and most of his possessions to Melzi. Now Leonardo da Vinci was a man of some means. His father was not poor, and he theoretically, earned a great deal of money over the course of his 67-year career. When his father died, he went back over to the hometown of his father in Vinci, and met with his many brothers and sisters, and had to go through the estate. It took him a number of years to go through all the estate. So he had some means. He left his estate to Francesco Melzi. Melzi eventually, after Da Vinci's death, got married and had a son, and Melzi in turn passed everything down to his son, and that's why so many of the pages of the notes were lost, because the son didn't, take the time to get them published, and they just disappeared. Leonardo da Vinci was known to be an extremely good-looking man. He was filled with grace. He had abundant talent, we all know. They described him as having outstanding physical beauty. He was a vegetarian. He had a regal spirit, tremendous breadth of mind, which is no surprise to any of us. And he was, when you call him a Renaissance man, he was just beyond brilliant, and that's not to take anything away from anybody else. The three top men of the Renaissance period, the cornerstone of Renaissance art, are Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Raphael only lived to be age 37. Michelangelo to be 88. You'll hear about him next week. So Da Vinci, even though he didn't leave a lot of paintings for us to admire, his brilliant thinking and the inroads that he made left a lot for us all to enjoy. For my last chart, being an artist, I can't not address this one. What contributions did he leave? He made a lot of innovations in techniques in layering on the paint, particularly with oil paint. His detailed knowledge of anatomy, light, botany, geology, he was always trying to figure out how things worked. Portraying the human emotion and gestures, the figurative composition. Another thing that he probably didn't invent, but he did make it well known, when you're painting a landscape, things in the far distance are more muted and they're less distinct. And that's really kind of an atmospheric thing. He did a lot of work on understanding why the sky is blue with the way the air particles are disseminated. The perspective, the subtle gradation of tone, and I have to mention folds, because when we have painting classes, everybody's frustrated with folds. He had some fabulous folds. So we'll be talking about that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Wanted to let you know did you mention the paintings? The paintings that you see displayed here are the work of Elaine Thillen, Jim Barton, Shannon Candler, Ked Murray, and myself. And Gary invited us to bring paintings in so that while we talk about this series of Renaissance and other artists and spirituality, that we could bring a little bit of our own in for you to enjoy. Most of them are oil, no egg tempera. There are some watercolor. But anyway, I hope you enjoy them, and I really, really appreciate your attention. Okay, here's the hard part. Any questions? Yeah, who invented scissors? Remember that.
Did he do all the inventions at a separate time from the paintings, or were they intermingled?
Good question. Did he do the inventions at a separate time? Actually, they were all intermingled, and that's one of the reasons he didn't finish some of his paintings. When he was doing the Last Supper, it was funny because he would spend maybe 3 days there painting nonstop. And then he'd go off and he might come in and he'd put a brushstroke down and he'd leave. And it made him so frustrated. I mean, because you never knew where he was going to be. But he could be walking through a village and he'd have his notebook with him all the time, and he'd see something and he'd stop and take notes, and he'd stop and just study it. So he spent a lot of time thinking and coming up with ways of improving things. So thank you, that's a good question. The paintings, like my human resources job, bought the groceries.
You alluded to this, but was Leonardo recognized in his life? I mean, was he famous, or was he well known and recognized? I mean, I know he did a lot of different things.
Excellent question. Was he recognized in his lifetime? Yes, he was. He was very well known. In fact, one of the books I read, not to get back to Michelangelo again, but that Michelangelo, from the time he was born, kept hearing about Da Vinci, because Da Vinci was like a generation, I guess, ahead, you know, because of his age. But he was very well respected. When he first went to work for the Farzo in Milan, he had been asked by someone to design a silver lyre, L-Y-R-E. I'm not sure I pronounced it right, but it's a musical instrument, in the shape of a horse head, which he did. And they liked it so much that he wrote this letter and told him everything he could do for him, because he was an inventor and he could do all these things. And it caused him to get that mission to be paid for by that particular ruling family. Good question. Yeah, he was very well respected. Gary.
Did he do the second version of the Last Supper, or was that another artist copying it?
The second version of the Last Supper was another artist. Here's what happened. I mean, when he painted the Last Supper because it was on plaster, the moisture starts seeping out, and that's what caused it to flake. And at one time, they actually even put a velvet curtain over it, which made it worse because it trapped all the moisture in there, and it made it so much worse. So when the first person came in, I don't know if it was the first or second one to try to do the restoration, they painted over. I mean, it was really in bad shape. It was flaking so bad. But the restoration artist took a little bit too much liberty, maybe because they couldn't find the guidelines, but thank you, that's a good question.
So the one that we see most often is a combination of the two, or the restoration?
I would say that what we see most often is a combination of the two. The one that, when I showed the original, I mean, the features are so different between them. And you look at the carved one over on the wall, which is a gift from Linda Maples and Bill. It's kind of a facsimile. But I'm going to go back to, this is a later version, but look at the first version here, which is much more believable because of the style in which Jesus' head was painted and all the disciples. Stephanie?
Were there any sketches of this before it was actually painted that was ever found?
That's a good question. Were there sketches of this before he painted? He was prolific in doing sketches. So yes, I know he did many sketches before he painted this, because this was huge. It was 15 by 29 feet, I believe, the finished. In fact, one king wanted to cut it off of the wall and move it, but never did, because he wanted it in his own possession. I don't know if of all the notes that the 7,000 pages that we have, if they include the Last Supper or not. But I know he did hundreds of sketches, so he sketched everything before he painted it. Fred?
Where is it now? Where is it now?
It's still in Milan. Still in the dining room. I don't know if it's open to the public though, Jim. Okay, it is.
Are any of these paintings in churches, and are any of them considered sacred?
The question is, are any of these paintings in churches and are any considered sacred? Well, I know two of the ones that I showed are in the Louvre, and there is one at least in Milan. I don't know the answer to that if they're in churches, and I don't know if they're considered sacred, but I would think they might be.
Did you ever say how many he actually painted, whether they were finished or not? I'm just wondering what this,
I don't know how many he painted. There are about 15 that we know of that have been saved. One I know he painted of, I remember reading about one in particular that he painted that is lost forever. There was one of two sisters that commissioned him to paint something, and he just kept not getting around to doing it because he had other things on his mind, but when he finally did it, it got lost. I mean, it's nowhere to be found. Bobby.
Gail, you had mentioned that that is in asked for forgiveness from the Catholic Church, wanted to go to heaven and so on. Was he ever at odds with the Catholic Church? In other words, did he ever have difficulties with the Catholic Church like other artists had when they were challenging the precepts of the church versus the wanting to know more about logic and reason and truth and so on?
A good question. Bob asked, was he ever at odds with the Catholic Church? I didn't read any documentation that he was, but being such focusing so much on reason as opposed to blind faith, he had to have been at odds at some point. My understanding from everything I've read is that he's just kept under the radar. He actually was imprisoned when he was about 23 he along with 3 other young men, he was imprisoned for sodomy by the Catholic Church. And it was the Medici family who got him out because the Medici family was related to one of the other young boys, and everything I've read is that it was not an accurate imprisonment, it was made up. But why it happened, I don't know. But he got out of prison, he never served any time, but nobody ever heard from him for about 2 years after that. He didn't do anything during those 2 years. I think just knowing what I've read about his beliefs and he understood that when he looked at all the geology, he looked at plant life, he looked at animal life, he looked at human life, that he knew there was a God. He didn't blindly believe everything that he was told through the Catholic Church, but he didn't confront them about it either. So I think he probably just kept under the radar. That's my opinion, just my opinion. Good question, though. Any other questions?
Thank you, Gail. A fabulous job she did. Come back next week for Ked Murray. We'll be doing Michelangelo, and we'll hear some more of the story. Thanks for coming. We appreciate you being here.